Today we're going to learn about wood gas griddles. This is how I set up my wood gas griddle. A griddle is a piece of cast iron which is heated and then you cook on the piece of cast iron. Griddles are used to make lots of delicious food. They're often used in restaurants to make lots of food fast. They're a very convenient way to cook. Griddles are often used over the coals on a fire, on a barbecue, or on an oven inside the house. Today I'm going to show you how I use wood gas stoves to heat the griddle. There's an advantage to using wood gas stoves, and it is a fuel advantage. You don't need very much fuel to make the griddle work. Wood gas stoves are very efficient, and they are also smokeless, or virtually smokeless. It takes a really small amount of fuel. In this case, I'm using wood pellets to get the griddle to work. In this case, I'm using 3 stoves. You could use 1 stove on each end, which would be 2 stoves, and then you would have less heat. I've used as many as 6 stoves, but I found this is a little bit too hot. I always use a windscreen around the wood gas stoves because if there's wind, it blows the flame out from underneath the cast iron griddle. You need some form of a windscreen to stop the wind, or these stoves will not work very efficiently. These stoves look like they're burning gas, but they're actually burning wood. So how a wood gas stove works is when there's a fire in the stove, there's also smoke, and the smoke has gases in it. So these stoves are actually burning the gases, and that's why there's no smoke coming from this fire, and that's why it's so efficient. And they burn quite hot too. You can see I have the stove set up in an outdoor fireplace just to be safe. So if there's any coals falling out from the stove, they will be contained in the fireplace. And I always watch the stoves when I'm using them. I'm putting on welding gloves now, so in case I touch something hot, my hands will not get burned, or they're much less likely to get burned. So now I'm going to put the griddle on top of the stoves. This is one way of doing it. There's a better way later on in the video. But once this cast iron griddle is hot, it is no longer a good idea to pick it up. You have to wait for it to cool because it gets very hot and it gets full of grease. So now I'm tapping the 4 sides of the wood gas griddle just to make sure that it is secure, that it won't tip. And it takes quite a while for the griddle to heat up because it's thick metal, and when heat hits the thick metal, it sort of gets diffused across the metal. See, this is, once the metal is hot, this is a couple minutes later, and you can see the griddle is very hot. The water is just turning into steam really quickly. So this means you have enough heat to cook on it. If you want less heat, you can wait until the flames die down and then there's embers, or you can just have 2 stoves, 1 on each end. Or you can use a different fuel. You could maybe use charcoal, which doesn't burn near as hot as the wood pellets. So this is what it looks like from underneath. You can see the flames are heating up the griddle, and it is getting really hot. The nice thing about wood gas stoves is that you can also use different types of fuel to fuel them. My favorite fuel is wood pellets, but you can also use twigs, and you can use little pieces of lumber as well. And you can also use charcoal, but it doesn't burn very hot, so it emits much less heat than wood pellets, twigs, or wood, lumber. You can see here, I'm just showing how hot the griddle gets. So if you wait until later on in the process, once the flame has died down, there'll just be embers in the wood gas stove, and then the griddle will be less hot. So the advantage of these stoves is that they are so efficient, which means you can cook for many times off of a couple bags of wood pellets or a very small amount of fuel. It's much more efficient than something else like a wood stove. So what I did here was I used some wire and some barbecue tongs to allow me to lift the hot griddle off of the stove. This is important because you need to be able to sometimes refuel the stove or to move the griddle around, and it's very difficult to handle even with welding gloves. So what I did was I took some wire, some steel wire, and I did a haywire twist around these holes in the side of the griddle. And I'm using welding gloves so that when I pick up the griddle, even if the wire is hot, it doesn't hurt my hands, and it's such a narrow wire that it can actually hurt your bare hands. So if you're wearing leather gloves, it's much easier. The wire has to be long enough that you can store it underneath the stove like this, and you also want the wire relatively long so that your hand is fairly far from the hot metal when you lift it up. So you can see it's a fair amount of wire. And the barbecue tongs will simply stabilize the griddle. See, now the wire is hooked on the corner. If I lift it, your food is going to fall off. So you have to be careful that the wire doesn't get stuck on a corner which is not connected using a haywire twist. I grab the wire in my hand, and then I lift up, and I can lift the hot griddle off of the stoves. I make sure that I don't accidentally come in contact with it or accidentally drop it on my feet. I keep it away from my feet. You can see the griddle is wobbling around, and if you've got food on there, you might lose your food onto the ground, and you don't want that. So I use a pair of barbecue tongs to stabilize the metal. I'm storing the wire now, making sure that it's in the outdoor fireplace and no one will accidentally get snagged on the wire and pull the griddle off of the stove. That's a haywire twist connection, and they're really easy to do. It's just twisting wire and making a loop. You can see, and you can see the welding gloves. I really like them because they keep my fingers nice and safe and they avoid burns. So now I'm just showing you what can happen if you accidentally bump something and you don't hold the griddle with some barbecue tongs. See, I would bump something and the food goes on the ground. That's no good. We don't want that. So we need a way to stabilize the griddle so that you can lift it on and off and keep it level with the ground. This griddle should also be leveled before I start it, so I should level the four legs of the outdoor fireplace, maybe with a shim or something like that, or a little piece of wood, before I turn on the fire, and you can use a level to do this. This leveling is only done when the stove and the metal are cool to the touch. You do it before you light the fires in the stove. Now I put on some oil and onion onto the stove, and I'm going to use a sharpened spatula to move the onions around and show how you can cook some food. You can cook your own type of food, but you can see how the technique works. There's lots of different recipes. So I'm just moving the griddle or the spatula around, and I'm using it and the food to spread the oil all over the griddle. So what you can do too is, if you want to make lots of food fast, you do a lot of what's called prepping the food. So you would cut lots of the vegetables, and you would cut them really small and thin, and then you would put them into little plastic bags. And say if you were doing ground beef or something like that, or some kind of meat, you would have the meat pre-cooked, and it would just be portioned into small sizes, put into the bags. These little bags, one portion per bag, and then put in a cooler or in the fridge. Then you can just take it out and you just warm up the meat, and the vegetables will cook really fast. So this is a technique that lets you produce a lot of food really fast. You could even pre-cook hamburgers and then you just warm them up on the griddle, and it only takes a couple minutes to warm them up, and this way you can make lots and lots of food really fast. This is kind of what restaurants sometimes do. They're just warming up food. And it's a very efficient way to make a lot of food fast. So here is a shot of the gloves, the welding gloves. I'm holding the wire, and now I'm grabbing the griddle with the barbecue tongs, and you can see it is now stable. It is in the air, suspended by the wire, and is not going to tip because the barbecue tongs are stabilizing it. And the barbecue tongs make sure that my hands do not come in contact with the hot metal, and the gloves are also there, the welding gloves, to stop any potential burn. Here's the process from another angle. I grab the wire, lift it up above the griddle, and then I grab the griddle with the barbecue tongs, and you can see it is very stable. I can move it around. The griddle is very hot, and I can safely move it around. Make sure you don't bump into anyone, and make sure you don't accidentally touch yourself with this hot griddle or drop it on your feet. Keep it away from your feet. And make sure it's stable and level so your food doesn't fall off. And I tap the four sides of the griddle again once I put it on the stove to make sure everything is stable. I'm using 2 pieces of wood to put the griddle onto, and you'll see why, because there's a gap underneath the griddle, and this allows me to easily pick up the griddle again. So the griddle is off the ground, and it's also very easy to pick up off of the ground. Just make sure you don't step on it or someone else steps on the hot griddle. You can see I lifted it off. Now I put it onto the pieces of wood, and I can lift it up again. Now I drop the wire. Just be careful that you don't snag your foot on the wire. Now I pick the wire up again with my welding gloves, and I bring the griddle back onto the stove. Say if I were refueling the stove, or I wanted to take the griddle off for some other reason. Like that, where I'm wearing welding gloves, I pick up the wire, and then I grab the griddle with the barbecue tongs and I lift it. I'm keeping it away from my feet, and you can see I can perfectly control the cast iron griddle. None of the food is falling off. I can vary the angle however I want. I can easily set the really hot griddle back onto the stoves without touching it or having the hot metal come near me. I'm going to lift it off again, and I'm going to put it back onto the pieces of wood. And I can easily grab underneath these pieces of wood because there is a gap. It's a very simple technique, and it also keeps the griddle clean. The bottom of the griddle is going to get very black and full of soot. I only use one side of the griddle when I'm using the wood gas stoves. Here's the process from another angle. I grab the wire with one hand using the welding gloves, and I use the barbecue tongs to stabilize the griddle. And I put it onto the 2 pieces of wood, and then I grab the griddle again and the wire. Now I can maybe refuel my stove. I grab the wire with one hand and the griddle using the barbecue tongs with the other hand, and I put it onto the stoves, and I can take it off again and put it onto the pieces of wood. It's really easy to do this, and it's better if you're wearing welding gloves. You can grab right underneath. See, there's a gap, and you can stabilize the griddle. I'm going to show you one more time. I grab the wire with one hand, and then I grab the griddle using the barbecue tongs with the other hand. And I safely store the wire in the outdoor fire pit and make sure that it can't be snagged by people passing by, or it does not get snagged on the corner of the griddle, so it won't dump my food accidentally onto the ground. Now I pick up the barbecue tongs, and you can see there is a big gap underneath the griddle, which makes it very easy to reach the barbecue tongs underneath. This is why we use 2 pieces of wood instead of 1 piece of wood. Makes it easier to pick up the griddle. Thanks for watching, enjoy your food, and have a great day.